Thank you all so much for coming. I have some more thank you remarks slated for later in the day, so I'm going to save those for then because I want to save some time for this panel. This is the second year that we've had a communications panel, and it's very pertinent, right? Because yesterday, we've heard multiple times people talking about, yeah, we need more communications. And as somebody who works in that space, I could not agree more. First, we're going to bring up Charlie Arnot. Charlie Arnot is Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Food Integrity, an international nonprofit dedicated to building consumer trust and confidence in today's food system. With more than 25 years in communications and issues management within food and agriculture, he is a sought-after speaker and writer on building trust in food. Arnot also serves as president of CMA, a strategic communications consulting firm, and holds a bachelor's of journalism from the University of Nebraska. Charlie.
Appreciate that, and I hope that despite the fact that I went to the University of Nebraska, where the N stands for knowledge, that you'll find some of what I have to say helpful. I could say it again, but I don't think it's going to be any funnier the second time. All right, so I want to talk today a little bit about an integrated trust system. We've been working on trust for 25 years, but this is the most dynamic environment that any of us have ever lived in when you think about communications and the challenge of trying to communicate, especially evidence-based information or science. So when we think about the trust gap that we're all experiencing today, people aren't rejecting innovation because they lack information. They're rejecting it when it doesn't align with their beliefs and values. They don't trust the messenger or the motive behind it. It creates uncertainty about what matters to them. It might be inconsistent with their values. Or when trust breaks down, it's not contained to one product or company. It erodes confidence in the broader system. So collectively, we've got a significant challenge ahead of us. Edelman did some research earlier this year, and they show that 70% of people globally now have an insular mindset, where they're not interested in accepting information from people that aren't like them, that different background, different values, different beliefs. So that creates some real challenges for us, but it also creates an opportunity because we're no longer just communicating information. We have to navigate interpretation. So we're going to talk about how we do that as we continue to move forward. So I want to talk about the shift from mass communication to masses of communicators and what it means to us. Truth is a social construct. We have to agree as a society what constitutes truth. And since Galileo came up with the scientific method, we've used mass communication as a way to support an evidence-based information culture, right? It was supported by mass communication, our television networks, our newspapers, radio. Journalists were trained to have two independent sources and to make sure they had factual information before they shared information to inform how we would consider new ideas, innovations, concepts, etc. All of that changed in 2004 when Facebook launched. No social control, no formal rules about information. We went from having a communication system focused on the middle of the bell curve to an infinite proliferation of microcultures across the population. And that has significant and profound implications for us because trust is increasingly fragmented. It's no longer concentrated in institutions. Research, again, by Edelman back in 2024 showed that now someone like me is as trusted as a scientist. So that has some pretty significant implications for us moving forward when we try to better understand how we're going to engage. And as I said before, authority is decentralized with the infinite number of channels that each of us have access to try and understand and make sense of the world. Today, Joe Rogan has 3 times the audience of MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News combined in prime time. Again, that has some fairly profound implications for us in terms of how we're going to communicate, how we're going to help people make informed decisions about what is best for society in food and agriculture. Because perception today is shaped by meaning, not by fact, right? Science is essential, but it's not sufficient in building trust. We have to be willing to embrace the fact that science plays a role, but it is not definitive in terms of how people are going to decide what they will and will not trust, because people interpret innovation through their emotion, through their identities, and through their values, not just through the science. Each microculture across the spectrum of the population has their own language at times, their own beliefs, their own values, and their own facts. And my facts are just as valid to me as your facts are to you. And so we're not going to be able to reach people and engage with them and shape their beliefs simply by arguing facts. Our peer-reviewed and published model shows that connecting on values is 3 to 5 times more important than sharing data and facts in building science. I'm sorry, more important than science in building trust. And we talk about using science in a conversation the same way you would use salt in a recipe. A little bit goes a long way. Too much, and it's ruined. So you have to be able to understand, how am I going to integrate science into that conversation in a way that helps build support for who we are and what we're trying to accomplish. So I want to share kind of a foundational model that I hope will provide some clarity in how we move forward. Values are what people think is important. They're relatively stable. After adolescence, our values tend to settle in. And when people challenge our values, they challenge our identity. And so that becomes a challenge for us. So when we argue with someone and we present information that challenges their fundamental values, we can expect they will become defensive. We can expect they will become aggressive, and it's not going to be a productive conversation. We map all of that through our proprietary cultural ethnography. I'll share more about that in just a bit. Beliefs are what people think is true, right? So values are what people think is important. Beliefs are what people think is true. Beliefs can be influenced. We have the opportunity to do that, but only if people believe we share their values. If they believe we share the values, they are then willing to give us permission to have some influence over their beliefs. But we have to have the messengers then who are willing and able to connect with people based on values first, so they can share information in a way that resonates and connects. So the strategy that we've developed at the Center for Food Integrity integrates both. We identify shared values, then shape beliefs, because again, we know that science is essential, but it is never sufficient. So we did an extensive digital ethnography. Ethnography is the social science of observation as opposed to direct inquiry. You observe what people do, how they behave, what they read, what they buy, what they talk about, what are their triggers to adopt and reject, et cetera, as opposed to asking direct questions. And through that, we identified the 5 different cohorts you see on the screen. We got the comfort seekers. Their reassurance is all about understanding who's in charge. The authenticity seekers, I'm only going to talk about them today in the interest of time. But if you would think about a label that would say sustainably raised or sustainably produced, the comfort seeker would go, somebody did the right thing. The authenticity seeker would say, show me your life cycle analysis, right? So each of these 5 different cohorts has different expectations of the type of information that will ultimately result in increasing their level of trust in who we are and what we do. So what we're able to do with the system is to essentially query them. We've created an agentic anthropologist, which allows us to query these consumer segments in real time. So last night I did some work on gene editing for a specific project. We can look at anything, right? So we can query them right now and get instant feedback on the perspective of the comfort seeker, the authenticity seeker, the rationalist, the progressive disruptor, and the strategist. In so doing, we have the opportunity to de-risk, because before we make a statement, before we have a position, before we come out with a new product or an ingredient, we have the opportunity to better understand and then continue querying. Why do you feel that way? What would need to be true for you to accept it? Who are the voices that you would trust in this conversation? We have the opportunity to do that in real time, which then can help us inform strategy. And then we also can calibrate, right? So this is fascinating. We work with trusted voices. You'll see a little bit of that in a moment. And these are influencers that will create content and then work on the content and post the content. We took the content from one of our trusted voices and we gave it to the insight engines. Worked really well for the comfort seeker, not so well for the authenticity seeker. We gave that feedback to the content creator. They then calibrated in a way that it worked better for both of those different cohorts. So again, the ability to do that kind of consumer insight work in real time gives us the ability to engage successfully in this incredibly dynamic environment. So that's what I have to share today. I hope you found it helpful. If you'd like more information, please let me know, and I'd be happy to share more at your convenience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Again, if you have questions, you can start throwing them into Slido. And you can vote on those questions that you like, that you want to rise to the top there. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jacquelyn Prestegaard. Dr. Jacquelyn Prestegaard is an assistant professor and AgriLife Extension Livestock Sustainability Specialist at Texas A&M University, where she develops extension programs that strengthen scientific literacy on livestock production and environmental stewardship. Her research and outreach center on adaptive grazing management, alignment of sustainability goals within the beef supply chain, beef and dairy cattle nutrition, and regenerative agriculture. She holds a PhD in dairy science from Virginia Tech and an MS in animal science from the University of Missouri.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here to be a part of this panel. I'm very honored, and I've also been delighted to hear talk about extension throughout the last couple days, the recognition of our role. And so today I'm going to give some examples of extension. I primarily work with cattle producers in my role as a specialist, and as a livestock sustainability specialist, one of the few people who specifically work in that area of extension in the country, lucky for me. I work at the intersection of primarily cattle, land, and climate. So a little bit of background about extension in Texas. We have 254 counties in Texas, and nearly every single one of those counties has an extension agent. And that person is a community leader, a community source of information for people in that region. But that person can't be expected to know everything about everything, right? They often have responsibilities in 4-H. If they're up in the panhandle, they might have questions, everything to cotton, to cattle, to gardening in between. They can't know everything. And so that's where specialists come in. We have beef specialists, we have feral hog specialists, we have livestock guard dog specialists. And so I work in the area of sustainability. And kind of like what Charlie was saying, whenever I go to a county, it's really important for me to first talk about shared value to get that trust from producers. Because the word sustainability, believe it or not, sometimes carries a negative connotation with producers. When I first started in my role, brand new, fresh out of grad school, I noticed that when I would go to producer meetings and say, I'm a livestock sustainability specialist, sometimes I'd get some eye rolls in the audience. And so I made it my mission to first, whenever I'm in front of a new group of people, to explain that sustainability to me means keeping you in business. It means the longevity of your operation, and we're just going to talk about the multiple ways that we can do that through productivity, profitability, environmental stewardship, and even social outcomes. And as in extension, I mean, Texas is, I've lived in quite a few states, as you heard from Joe, and Texas is extremely impressive with extension. We have hundreds of programs across the year through multiple topics. And so these are just a few select ones that I get to work on. In addition to I don't work with hundreds of county programs, but there are hundreds of county programs. But the largest beef cattle educational event in the country is the Beef Cattle Short Course. Last year we had over 2,000 primarily producers in attendance, and we're expecting to have that same amount this year. And so we do have influence because we are with extension. We are expected to be unbiased and brand agnostic primarily, and so that helps us establish trust with our producer audience. Also in May, I got to take over something called the Ranch Raised Beef Conference, and it's all about direct-to-consumer beef sales. And it used to be called the Grass-Fed Beef Conference, and we expanded it to include people who want to grain finish. But that was a really interesting new chapter for me because we had people who attended that conference who were interested in grass finishing their animals and grain finishing their animals. And sometimes it feels like a split between those two groups. And so the goal at that conference was to show that there is mutual understanding and need for education across production systems, and that it's not a us versus them thing. It's a all of us in this together type thing. And we have a lot of demand for our programs, and we do charge several $100s in registration for these programs as sort of a buy-in. Our Ranch Raised Beef Conference sold out very, very quickly. We had to cap it at 130 attendees. And finally, we have the Beef Sustainability Summit, which is a program I started in 2024, where we talk about a slew of issues from water to succession planning and maybe methane. Really, we don't talk a lot about methane, actually, because I hate to say this at the State of the Science Summit around reducing methane in animal agriculture. producers really don't like to hear about methane. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I talk about oh my gosh, I'm running out of time, the Resilient Ranch Network. So this is a project that's funded through the Walmart Foundation, where we recruited 40 ranchers in North Central Texas. That's a supply shed for Walmart's Prime Pursuit program. And we asked them, what outcomes matter to you on your operation? We asked them to rank their top 3 outcomes and their bottom 3 outcomes. We asked the same of 20 people who work in corporate beef sustainability. And there's a few folks in this room who participated in those focus groups. Because we know that ranchers today face environmental and market volatility challenges that differ vastly from corporate sustainability goals. What we found from this research is that ranchers are primarily driven by, we thought it would be profitability, but overwhelmingly they talked about legacy. They talked about their concern about land use change. And overwhelmingly, when we asked them to rank their bottom 3 outcomes that they care about, methane was always at the very bottom, and so was carbon. But guess what? When we asked corporate sustainability beef experts the same questions, guess what was at the top? Methane and carbon. So there is a misalignment, which we weren't surprised to find. And this Venn diagram shows what the top 3, just the top, we didn't put the bottom 3 here, the top 3 aspects that mattered to industry partners in our rancher groups within this project. Legacy, overwhelmingly number 1 for ranchers, carbon insetting and offsetting, scope 3 emissions reporting for industry folks. And we also wanted to find where the alignment occurs, because just because ranchers don't like to talk about methane doesn't mean we need to just put our head in the sand and hope it goes away, or try to make them comfortable about it. Like, it's important that we mitigate our methane. And so the next phase of this project is to find what are the boundary objects that can align us across the supply chain. We think it could be related to soil health. We think it could be related to whole ranch efficiency as well. And so that's the next phase of this project, to find what are the metrics that matter across both of these groups. And I'm just going to close with a few slides that I present at the Ranch Raised Beef Conference and several other, several other programs that I get to give when I talk about sustainability and climate goals for beef producers. I give them confidence. I say, you are often if you're going to talk to consumers, you are very often the only beef producer that they've ever talked to. And so what you say at a farmer's market or on your website, it matters. So we go through some of the high-level science. Sometimes we don't get too deep into it, but we do talk about climate. We talk about the big bad beef packer. There's some of those in this room. And yield per carcass, antibiotics, and hormones. And we talk about why marketing with integrity versus selling against someone else's beef product matters for the greater beef industry. Here are a few messages that we encourage people to adopt, especially if they're thinking about selling direct to consumer. Not to bash the big guy, not to bash grocery store beef, not to say, oh, our beef isn't full of hormones. Well, all mammals produce hormones, so if you want to get technical about that there. Because, and I believe this is research from the Center for Food Integrity, but it's better to lift the whole industry together versus when we're talking about consumer-facing trust versus saying my beef is better than theirs because they use a bunch of hormones. Like, that doesn't necessarily build trust in your beef product. It just kind of signals to consumers that the beef industry as a whole is kind of sketchy. And so this is messaging that we really try to encourage with beef producers, to tell your story without standing on someone else's. So I'm looking forward to the panel, and I really appreciate you guys listening this afternoon and sticking around for the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. And if you haven't been to one of her events, you should try to make it out for that. I went out to last year's Beef Sustainability Summit. An absolute great event. I actually recruited her from there. Andy, who's leading the next panel, Sarah was there, who I am going to introduce next. So Dr. Sara Klopatek is Global Chief Livestock Scientist at JBS, where she leads livestock sustainability research, regenerative agriculture initiatives, carbon accounting, life cycle assessment development, and land use change model development. Her expertise spans environmental science, animal agriculture, and climate strategy across beef, pork, and poultry systems. Her focus regions include North America, Brazil, Australia, and the UK. Please welcome Sara Klopatek, Dr. Sara Klopatek.
Thank you, everyone, and excellent presentations. I guess we can phrase, I'm Sarah. I am in the quote group of Big Bad Packer. We have some good stories to share, Jacquelyn and I. It was a really exciting meeting and incredibly useful. I was invited here to talk a little bit about some of the graduate work. Yes, I finally got it published. Jim Olchin is in this room. And talk about rancher perceptions and why a producer would or would not adopt a practice. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly, but we can ask questions while on the panel. So Jim and I started this work a little while ago, and the big question in the room was, why would a producer adopt a practice, especially with the new methane laws that had come out? There was a lot of corporate focus coming down the supply chain, and there was a lot of questions in the room saying, why would a producer do something new? Why would they want to do something new? And at the time of this research, there was a dearth of information available about why a producer would or would not adopt a practice. But there was a program on the ground that was pretty phenomenal. And I do have to shout out my PI once again, Dr. Jim Olchin, that was paramount in being a part of this program, and it was called Beef Quality Assurance. And this program really revolutionized the beef industry as far as injection site lesions. And at the time, injection site lesions in the early 90s were a huge problem, especially for the packers, because you would have this whole cutout because if the injection was in the wrong place, it would be infected and you were losing a lot of the cut. But then when this program came about, we discovered that injection site lesions had gone down by over 95% within 15 years. So it was phenomenal. And Jim and I said, well, this program worked. Why did this program work? So we put together a survey and we asked producers around the country why they chose to be a part of BQA. And then we asked questions, why would they join a different rancher educational program? And from this work, we had 2 publications that did come out. One was focused on beef quality assurance, and then the other publication was focused more on grazing management and sustainability issues. So I put a couple of these slides in actually because of lunch yesterday. I had some lovely comrades at the table and they were asking some questions. And one of the questions was, who do producers trust? And who do they trust to get information from, and what information do they trust? So one of the questions in the survey we asked is, what makes you trust or believe in a ranching educational program? Some good news here. As you can see at the bottom, science is still very much trusted among the community. And then followed by, let's see here. Most individuals, are enrolled in the program, which was interesting that we saw just because another producer was doing the program did not necessarily mean that they were more likely to trust the program. But if the producer said that this program was rewarding for them, then they were more likely to join the program. And then we asked, how did producers learn about cattle production practices? Mind you, this data was collected in 2019 or 2020. I saw the phone go up and down. And this is really important because we are hoping to redo this survey and send it out again. I'm wrangling this woman on stage to do it with me. We'll see if we'll get it done. But we want to re-ask this question. But this is back in 2019, and over 50% of producers were using Facebook, any kind of social media. I don't think TikTok fully took off yet. That's what dates this a little bit. And I remember there was a woman on a bus, and she was this fabulous producer. She was 78 years old, and she asked to join me on Facebook. And at the time, I don't have social media, but I thought that was fantastic. And it really showed that producers are online. Everything is on their phone. And I know that this number has skyrocketed since then. So where the information is going and how you're trying to target your audience is going to be incredibly important. And that stigma that producers don't use social media, that is just what it is, the stigma. They absolutely are using social media to get information. And then I asked a question in the survey, and again, reminding the audience, it's 2019. I said, as producers, what are your top 2 priorities for ranching? And I was stunned by the result that came back. And the number 1 response that came back was improving and maintaining the ranch publicity and public image. And what was interesting is there was no significant difference in this answer if the producer was in Texas, in California, in Oregon, in Dakota, in any of the Dakotas. So what this showed is this was a ubiquitous concern among our producers. And I would say we're in a very positive beef environment in some areas and a not very positive beef environment in others. But this is going to continue to be a concern for our producers. There's more and more technology, there's more and more knowledge, there's more and more AI, but there's less and less facts. And this is really hard to how can the man and the woman with the boots on the ground get their story and what they do across. Then we've asked our producers, what does sustainably mean to them? This is probably the cutest research I ever did. This is a word cow. And the bigger the word, the more often it's referenced. And I think what Jacquelyn pointed out earlier was spot on. And in this paper, we call it time horizon and longevity. And what you really see here is generations, family, and you have to remember the time scale with producers. It's not a week, it's not a month, it's decades, it's generations that they're looking at. Profitability, incredibly important. Remember, at the end of the day, a ranch is a business. If you can't keep that ranch profitable, you do not have a ranch, you do not have a business, you don't have meat. Ranching is a business, and it's a family business more often than not. Herd health, right up there. I think it's really important if you're looking at a program, it's really important to also focus on herd health. And I pointed this out last year, greenhouse gases is not on here. And it's just what Jacquelyn said too. Does that mean you can't have those conversations? No. But can you tie it to profitability? Can you tie it to herd health? Can you tie it to lasting to generations? You got to have what they're saying, stacking and win-wins and all these. You got to bring the full picture together. If you're going to talk about methane, talk about soil health. If you're going to talk about soil health, talk about your grasses. If you're going to talk about your grasses, talk about your gain. Put everything together, and then you have a story, and then you have sustainability. Really quickly on this slide, 101. If you're in the black, you're good. You're in the red, no so bueno. So what you have here is the beef supply chain. And what I really want to get across here today is having a conversation with a cow-calf producer is not the same conversation you have with a feeder. It's not the same conversation you have with a packer, and it's not the same conversation you have with a retailer. All of these sectors, we're tied together because we're all putting food on your table, but we're all at different stages. The meat business is not the cattle business. They're different businesses. The retail business is not necessarily the beef business. So they all have different obstacles, and you have to be aware of the conversations and know who's in the room to have those conversations. Talking to a packer might be different than cow-calf. Talking to cow-calf is going to be different than talking to McDonald's. And on a completely different note, I think continuing to break down barriers and break down scientific barriers within academia to corporate, within academia to cow-calf and production systems we need to continue to have research that go across the sectors. And my team, including Dr. Sara Klopatek, Logan Thompson, and Matthew Beck, we continue to look at methane in a different, innovative way of saying, how can we use a newer metric, GWP star, in corporate accounting. And we just published a paper on how to use GWP star in corporate accounting. So this paper will be live here in the next week. But what I wanted to bring this up is saying that communication is so critical, and it's going to be harder, but we need more of it. And we need more of it between academia and the corporate side, because we're going to have more and more challenges, and we need the scientists in the room, and we need the corporates in the room together to make these wins occur. That's it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Next, I'm going to introduce Susan Solorio. Susan Solorio is the Senior Director of External Communications at Elanco Animal Health, where she leads North America communications, including the company's sustainability portfolio. Her work includes communicating Elanco's enteric methane reduction efforts, the U.S. launch of the feed ingredient Bovaer, and the 18 volunteer livestock carbon insetting marketplace. Solorio brings 2 decades of experience working on behalf of farmers and ranchers through agricultural trade associations.
Well, thanks, everybody. I'm excited to be here with all of you, and I hope you take as much away from our panel today as I've taken away from your fantastic presentations. It's been really invigorating to see the great work that's happening across the globe, but I would say more importantly, hear the dialogue, the openness, the desire to be able to work together more consistently to make sure that we're advancing animal agriculture and sustainability together. So let me talk a little bit about who Elanco is, because there's probably several of you in the room being like, why is an animal health company standing in front of me today? We are leading a global animal health company, and today our portfolio is made up of about 50% farm animal products. That's part of our heritage. We're a 70-year-old, we call ourselves a 70-year-old startup company. We actually got our start with Eli Lilly and Company. We were the farm animal division of Eli Lilly and Company. We spun off and IPO'd in 2018. And then we had several acquisitions where we bought pet health products as well. So today we're about a 50-50 focus on pet and farm, about a 50-50 focus on US and international, with a number of different core species. We've got more than 200 brands across our product portfolio. And while I don't alone work on those 200 brands day in and day out, one of the things that I really want to talk about today is the fact that as we look at our portfolio, as we look at our global presence, one of the things that we're tasked with within our team is how do we maintain trust in a company the size of Elanco, and how do we make sure that we're maintaining trust across a variety of different stakeholders. So when you think about our business and the people that we're tasked with maintaining trust with, you've got our investors. We're a publicly traded company, right? We've got our customers. So on the farm side of our business, that's our nutritionists, our veterinarians. We've got our producers, of course, farmers, ranchers, pig farmers, poultry producers, et cetera. The list goes on and on. On the pet side of our business, you've got also veterinarians, small companion animal, and then you've got your pet owners and your consumers. And the consumer is really one of the ones that I want to make sure that I hit on today, because I would say that's one of our newer areas of focus on the farm side of our business. When I joined Elanco 4 years ago, part of the opportunity that I saw was taking what I've learned in animal agriculture, what we continue to do to communicate effectively and build trust with consumers on the pet side of our business, right? More pets are in our homes today, sleeping in our beds, sleeping on our pillows. And we effectively communicate with pet owners, right, to trust the products that we bring to market. How can we take those lessons learned into animal agriculture? And that's one of the things that I'm really blessed to be able to work on day in and day out at Elanco. So I'm going to focus in a little bit on what we're doing in the sustainability space, and specifically methane reduction. If you've heard anybody from our team, including our CEO, Jeff Simmons, speak, we are passionate that we believe animals are part of the answer to some of society's most pressing challenges. Certainly feeding the world, but from a companion animal standpoint, we also believe that they solve a lot of life's challenges, mental health, keeping people healthy and vibrant, et cetera. And when we look at specifically what we can do to make sure that we're creating the next layer of demand and giving people what they want and need is more animal protein. In the US alone, we're seeing that demand continue to rise. We were talking about that at the table yesterday and then at my table today. We're seeing great need for consumption. And along with that rising demand for animal protein, we also have to think about what is the sustainability, what does the on-farm carbon footprint look like? So while we work on a variety of traditional animal health tools like vaccines that keep animals healthy, antibiotics that treat illnesses and disease, those are core to our Elanco portfolio. But a key area that we've really started to invest in over the past decade or so is sustainability, and specifically methane reduction and enteric methane reduction, because we believe that that is a key opportunity to continue to reduce the footprint of the animal, but also because we think it's an opportunity for the industry to create value. Our core focus has really been centered around being a leading partner in animal protein sustainability. And I think what's different about our approach is that we are working together across the value chain in order to make sure that there is value at each step of the chain. So we believe that it's a voluntary opportunity, certainly for producers, to be able to implement innovations on their operations. But at the end of the day, what we want to make sure of is that that producer, if they are implementing something, that they find value in it. That a food company, as Sara pointed out at the end of the chain, finds value in it as well. So our 4-pillar strategy for sustainability looks like this. We bring new innovations to market. As Joe mentioned, we are the provider of 3-NOP or Bovaer here in the US. We have a strategic alliance with DSM Firmenich, which is the creator of Bovaer. And so we've successfully brought that to the US dairy marketplace for lactating cattle. We don't believe in just, though, implementing, as I mentioned, an innovation. We believe that you've got to measure, right? So we can continue to improve. And so we've actually launched a tool called UpLook, which allows producers to measure their greenhouse gas emissions on beef and dairy operations and then take credit for those calculations. And that is ultimately the first step in creating value and producers being paid back for implementing some of these innovations. The key area that I want to talk a little bit about and end with is advocacy, and I think that'll tee us up really nicely for the last panel. Historically, when we've talked about advocacy, we think about legislative, we think about lobbying. What we're thinking about today is very different. How do we communicate with consumers about some of these key technologies and key information? And I want to end with a piece of research that I think will, again, tee up our discussion with my co-panelists here today to talk a little bit about how do we need to shift the narrative and make sure that when we're talking to an audience, the way that we're communicating can help build trust or it can help break trust, right? We did some really interesting work. We worked with CFI. We worked with a group called the Maslansky and Partners. And a lot of what you'll hear is that it's not necessarily what you say, it's what people hear. And we've got to do a better job, I would say, in agriculture in thinking about how do we find that common goal with the audience that we're speaking to. I think several of my panelists, co-panelists pointed that out. It's about finding a common ground, finding a common goal, not necessarily creating a new problem that doesn't exist in people's minds, right? We need to focus on trying to explain in our audience's terms, what is it? What's the product that I'm even talking about? So whether you're talking about a methane reducing feed ingredient or whether you're talking about a new product that we're selling at the grocery store, right? How can we explain to them in terms that they understand what it's like? We don't necessarily need to tell them everything about what it is. We like to think that they want to know literally everything, but they don't, right? They need a little bit of information. Why to trust it, talk about the standards that it meets and not the supporters behind it. And then ultimately, what's the benefit to them? Bring it back to why does it matter? So I'm hoping that gives us a little bit of a good tee-up conversation, Joe, into how we can continue to communicate and build trust within the industry, and look forward to the questions that we'll take here. Thank you.
Okay. So again, if you have any questions, please put them in Slido, and also vote for the ones that you kind of want to hear the most, in there. I got a super simple question that you guys kind of all touch on to start out, and we'll just start with Charlie and come down. For you and your audiences that you're addressing, why isn't data enough to make those messages?
Because data isn't what matters, right? You can give me data, but if it's not something that's relevant to me or important to me, your data has no meaning at all, right? So you have to be able to identify, why would I care? And then talk to me in a manner that addresses the issues that are important to me. So you can provide all the data in the world, but if I'm not interested in the topic or the data, it falls completely flat.
Yeah. So there are 700,000 individual cow-calf operations in the United States, and the average size is about 35 head. And the vast majority of those operators, having cattle is not their primary source of income. They have a day job. And so having cattle is more of a hobby or a lifestyle. And so they're busy with their day job and they have cattle. And so sometimes record keeping, a lot of times record keeping and data, it just falls down the priority list, I believe.
I would say the question, why isn't it data enough? I think, I'm sorry, this is the most scientific answer ever. It depends. Like if we're at this conference and, Frank's presenting p-values, like everyone's like, okay, yeah, I see that. Oh, experimental design, excellent, well done. Okay, that worked, that didn't work. I think a lot of times you'll have like a news report or they'll have a scientific study in the news and they'll say, well, who published it? Oh, well, they're in the meat industry or they're in the alternative meat industry. And so it's like a trust in the data and who is presenting it. I think that we're seeing more and more issues with just overall trust. And we're also seeing a degradation of trust in the scientific community, which hurts, but it's there.
Move on. Yeah, I think they covered it great.
Well, we'll go to you because this is one of the higher ranked questions here. Can you just, Season, we're going to jump right into it actually here. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the most pressing challenges Elanco is facing in communicating with farmers and consumers about Bovaer, particularly given what's happening in Europe?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just level set a little bit on some of the conversation that's been happening in Europe. So is clearly whoever upvoted it or put the question in is aware, but there's been some questions. Bovaer has been introduced to the European market well before it was introduced here in the US. And over the past couple of years, there have been some, I would say, misinformation that's floating around on social media about the safety, the efficacy of the product. So we've been working really closely with DSM Firmenich, as I mentioned, who is the creator of Bovaer, on that. And a couple of things that I would say is, one, from what we have seen in our adoption here in the US, we've honestly seen really great success. We've fed 150,000 cows Bovaer over since 2024 when we introduced the product. UC Davis right now, for those of you that aren't aware, is doing one of the longest feeding trials. I've had the opportunity personally to come out here several times. Thank you, Frank and Joe, for welcoming us to see those cows being fed. I've honestly been out on several of our producers' operations that have been feeding cows, and we're seeing great success. Our farmers are happy. Our retention rates are extremely high. And the food companies or the companies at the end of the carbon inset market that are buying those credits from those methane reductions with farmers feeding Bovaer continue to come back as well. So we're seeing great success here in the US. I would say what's very different about the approach here in the US is that it's very voluntary. And I can't echo enough how important we think it is at Elanco to make sure that these are voluntary innovations, that these are voluntary opportunities for producers. Where a lot of the questions are coming from right now is in Denmark, where farmers are being forced to feed a methane-reducing feed additive, not just Bovaer. I think they have one other option. And that's not the system that we have here in the US. We don't believe in forcing farmers to do things. I think there's a couple farmers in the audience. I don't think they like being forced to do things. I don't want to speak for them. But that's something that we're seeing that is, again, very different. But we've seen great safety, great efficacy, great results here in the US. We're disappointed that there's, some of that misinformation that is floating around out there, but we're also really dedicated to making sure that the value chain, especially that we work with in the US, has the right information, that they know how to feed the product, and that they feel continuously confident in the product. The last thing I would add is from a consumer confidence standpoint, that has been a key area where we've really focused is how do we talk about a product like 3-NOP, or how do we talk about other products as we bring them to the marketplace? So we've invested heavily in some consumer research to better understand that. I showed you some of the construct of some of the takeaways, I would say, at a high level. And then really what we're doing is turning that into activations. We're working across the value chain with different groups to make sure that they understand what Bovaer is and the safety efficacy, and then working with the right messengers to communicate that information, including our value chain partners. So I hope that helps address it.
Yeah, that was a great answer.
Joe, if you don't, can I just add on to that? I mean, we just completed a piece of research on innovation in agriculture that does not impact food. Next week, we're beginning one on ag innovation that impacts food. Had a chance to share some of this with the Clear Center board earlier. But one of the things that Susan said, I think, is essential, because in terms of consumer acceptance, if the innovation is perceived to be a tool that helps farmers as opposed to replaces farmers, and if farmers have the ability to have agency or control over whether or not they use or embrace or integrate the technology, that makes all the difference in the world in consumer acceptance. Not farmer acceptance, but consumer acceptance. Is it a tool that helps farmers or replaces farmers? And is it a tool that farmers have the agency or the ability to make a decision about whether or not they will use that innovation?
Yeah, great point. Charlie, can you briefly kind of explain how you got to the archetypes? You know, talking about the psychographics of it.
You bet, you bet. So ethnography is the social science of observation as opposed to inquiry. So instead of asking a question, you're observing people's behavior. So we work with a partner to do this large-scale digital ethnography, starting with a sample of 7,000 consumers that are anonymized, and then going back 2 years in their history. Everything they've done online, what they buy, what they read, what their political stances are, triggers to adopt, triggers to reject, all of that information across 7,000 consumers. That's divided then, the group of PhD anthropologists takes a look at that information and goes, based on what we know and the question you've asked in terms of how do consumers think about truth when it comes to food and agriculture, here's how we would organize the population. They do that with 4,000 consumers initially, come up with a hypothesis. They give the hypothesis to another group of PhD anthropologists who take a separate sample of 2,000 consumers and determine whether or not the hypothesis is valid. So that's the process. It's a total of over 50,000 total data points across those consumers, which then provide the input for the PhD anthropologists to do the segmentation.
And these groups, they're not, the question, we have a question on here. Tested in different countries? Are they tested in different countries, relevant and applicable across culture and range of economies?
Yeah, so this was only done in the United States. When we talk about shared values and connecting on values, values are culturally specific. We've done our values-based communication training in 15 countries across 5 continents. So you can find shared values across cultures and across geography, but you can't assume that the values that are important in one culture or one geography will translate to another culture or another geography. So it's important to understand and spend some time understanding the culturally specific values for which you are going to try to find alignment.
Jacquelyn, what would you say is the most underappreciated part of the current animal ag system that, if better understood, would unlock more constructive conversations?
The most underappreciated?
Yeah.
The extension.
Yeah. A lot of people say that extension is like the best kept secret that land-grant universities have. And somebody earlier was asking me today, like, oh, how much demand do you have? You know, how often do you have to, like, how do you decide where to go and which counties to go to? And actually, I don't get asked to go out to the county and speak about sustainability as much as I would really like to. And I mean, I encourage all the time, like producers, to, when I just meet them out in the wild, like, here's my email, here's my phone number, like, call me. I'm literally paid by the state government to be a free consultant for you. And so, and we're very interconnected. So like, if I don't know the answer to a question, you know, I get questions about ag law all the time, and I am not a lawyer, but we do have an ag law specialist. And just because you don't live in Texas doesn't mean you can't talk to Texas specialists either. So I would say that.
I will add to that, based on some conversations we've had too, is like on the research side of things as well, bringing in that extension component to it, making sure like when you put together grants, you can build that in, right? And it is important to build in funding for that as well.
Right, and we don't only serve producers or consumers. I talk to industry quite a bit, and I talk to ag tech startups quite a bit too, because they want to know like what are producers thinking of? Do you poke some holes in our um, uh, new product to tell us like would people actually want to buy this? And I poke a lot of holes. I'm really good. I'm a professional hole poker.
So this was asked for Sarah, but we'll start with Sarah. But if anybody else wants to jump in on this too, be very appropriate. Sarah, I hear a lot of people say they trust science or use science in decision making, but I find that is less likely to be true when the scientific facts are not consistent with their beliefs. How could you tease out these two groups in your survey?
I'm trying to think back to the survey. So the question is those, if they trust science or if they, can you rephrase that?
Yeah, so a lot of people will say they trust science or they use science in their decision making, but it's not always true when the science doesn't align with what their values are and what they believe. So how could you, tease those groups out, make some of their answers stand out a little bit more in these surveys if you were to do more?
I think one way that what we saw, it wasn't like you were able to tease it out, but what you saw is they would say they trust scientists, but the trust in university professors was much lower. And so, and I didn't post that slide. And so they said science was one of the highest sources of trust, but as far as people they trust, scientists were in the middle to lower categories. So I think that's a way that you do see that, is that maybe a university professor they don't see as someone that is boots on the ground, knows farming, knows ranching, and so they don't have as high of trust. But when they see science, maybe it's, the trade publications coming out that had a study and they trust that.
Joe, if I could, I think a lot of that goes to the motivation bias, right? What is the motivation behind the science or behind the work that was done? And is that motivation aligned with my values and interest? If the motivation is aligned with my values and interest, I'm more likely to trust the data. If I believe the motivation is not aligned with my values and motives, I'm less likely to trust the data. So the data is essentially a proxy for, am I comfortable with the motivation behind it?
I think this is going to be a continuous struggle in our industry, because we are scientists that are working in animal proteins. And since you're in animal proteins, people are going to think you have an inherent bias regardless of your p-values, regardless of where you publish. And I don't know how we can continue to get better. I believe there's things we can do. I don't know how to like pinpoint like what can we do to help with that bias, but there's always just going to be groups that.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think, if the research shows that, again, 26 countries, excluding China and Saudi Arabia, that someone like me is as trusted as a scientist, how do we make scientists more someone like me, right? That's part of it. It's also to recognize that science is not values neutral. Our values come into our hypothesis development. Each of us brings a certain worldview and experience and perspective to what we do when it comes to science. The scientific method can be consistent, but how we come into that conversation is going to be influenced by our values.
So do scientists need to become influencers then?
Please tell us we do not have to go on TikTok. Jacquelyn and I do not want to do that. We can do a dance.
So nobody has to, but what you can do, what we do is we'll find those groups of trusted voices, and then we have 200 faculty in our best food facts that will then brief those trusted voices to make sure what they're sharing is going to be resonant and fact-based, right? So we use the scientist as a foundation to then connect with and provide information to the influencers, so what they're sharing resonates with their audience because they already have a trusted audience, but it's going to be fact-based.
Yeah, I would add on to that. Some of the research that we have done has actually found that for that some of our work, that actually scientists are very well trusted. I would say specifically, I'll give a shout out to Davis and Cornell, I think know are in the room, and CSU. I've literally seen those research universities unprompted come up in some of our research as very well trusted voices in animal ag space. So, to Charlie's point, it's then about how do you continue to elevate those trusted voices, and how do we elevate more? I think we've known for 10 plus years at least, right, that we need a lot of voices in animal agriculture. But to Charlie's point, part of what we're finding is we need more and more to continue to raise our voice up. Doesn't mean you have to get on TikTok, Sarah, or Sarah and Jacquelyn, but it means that ultimately we need to do a better job of using the voices we do have and elevating them together. So.
Yeah, in terms of we realized we weren't going to be able to grow fast enough to compete.
Yes.
So we identified a network of influencers that have a combined organic reach of 35 million. Right. So that gives us partners that we can work with that have the kind of reach we need. Now we can continue to brief them, give them fact-based information to empower them to be more effective.
Fantastic. To kind of build a little bit on this season, I've seen, your communications lead with science in a lot of different ways. How do you have to change it, or do you, when you talk to the different audiences? Do you have broad audiences that you're trying to address?
Yeah, no, we've changed it a lot. And, Charlie had a great slide about, we've gone from, mass communications to mass communicators, right? And sometimes, honestly, as a publicly traded company, it's tough because we do still have to put out things like press releases that reach a very wide audience. And so I can't tailor every single message we put out. But we're thoughtful about the messages we put out. So to your point, if I'm talking to an investor audience, what they care about is our EBITDA. And I can't even explain to you what that means because I honestly still don't know 4 years into working for a publicly traded company. When we're talking with our producers, honestly, to somebody's point earlier, we're talking about their livelihoods, their longevity, their, what they've always done, what are their traditions on the operation. When we're talking to consumers, we want to make sure that we're leading more with the values that they have. And I would say for the consumer audiences that we're typically thinking about, our consumer audiences are concerned about making sure that, what we're doing on the farm doesn't change the food that they've always loved, right? They love our food system. They love our beef. They love dairy, et cetera. They want to make sure that it's the same thing that they've always had. It's not going to cost them anymore because right now we are at a point where beef prices are very high and people are willing to pay for that. But they want to make sure that they're not having to pay more because of something we have done on the farm. And they want to then make sure that ultimately it's safe and effective, right? So we're leading, I would say, with, again, going back to kind of my construct, if you would, what's the common goal? What's in it for me? And that's something we're thinking about much more frequently when we're talking with individual audiences.
And Jacquelyn, how are you translating some of the science to producers? Some that maybe have preconceived notions about the topics like methane or something like that. Now they're wrong or bad, just like they're still learning. So how do you bring the science to them?
That's a really good question. And I've talked to a few people about this the last few days, and I say that every time I get the opportunity to speak to producers, I do try a new approach. And I've had to shift from anxiety about trying that a new approach to seeing every new opportunity to speak to producers as a learning, a chance to grow and try something new. But what really seems to work as far as translating science to producers is, well, first of all, acknowledging and admitting that words and the way that you frame things really does matter. I was really stubborn at the beginning with wanting to talk about climate change to producers and talk about methane mitigation to producers and human-induced global warming. And people shut down. I mean, producers will just shut down when you say those buzzwords. And so shifted now more towards what are called like high truths, like something that everybody can agree on. For example, wow, those floods that we saw last year in Central Texas were absolutely devastating. 1,000-year flood. That was horrible, right? Or that the last time, several years ago, when the Gulf lost power for weeks on end because of a 1,000-year hurricane. Sure seems like we're seeing a lot more of these 1,000-year events. So sort of leading with something that everybody can agree on, and then presenting the science to them in a way that's digestible, and that doesn't induce shame. Like shame never works. I mean, shame just induces fear. And when people are afraid, they there's fight, there's flight, and there's freeze. It rarely induces meaningful change. And so presenting the science in a way that isn't meant to make another group feel shame for their decisions, because you never know why they make those decisions. Like context completely matters. So really the science itself is the easy part, but how you frame it and tailor it to each individual audience really matters, and it shows that you care. They don't care about what you know until they know how much you care.
Fantastic. Last question, just some quick answers. If you could leave, the folks here in this room with a tip about like, hey, how can I go out and communicate around this topic? What would you say to them?
I would say listen first to try to identify a common value or a place of connection, exactly what you've done, right, in extension, and then begin the conversation, as opposed to here are the 6 facts you really need to know, which is going to alienate and turn your audience off.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I've pretty much said how I approach that. Yeah.
I would say do a little bit of background research. Know your audience. Is every family the same? Not every ranch is the same. Understand the producer you're talking to, the region, the issues they're in. Are you talking to a packer or are you talking to a feeder? Know their struggles, know they're different, and know why.
Everything they said, and then I would add on Jacquelyn's slide where you talked about sell on your own attributes, don't sell against, right? Because I hope in this room we can all agree that we're going to need more innovations in order to feed more people, in order to keep our animals healthier, in order to reduce methane. Insert your why at the end. And the only thing that we do when we bash other innovations, right, is we make people scared of the category. And so I loved that slide. Kudos and thank you for putting that up there. And I really wanted to make sure to echo that.
Awesome. Let's give them a round of applause.